The funeral home was packed with 200 people, all dressed in black, all pretending to mourn a man most of them barely knew. I stood next to my father's mahogany casket, my fingers gripping the edge of the pew so hard my knuckles had turned white. The smell of lilies was overwhelming, mixing with expensive perfume and cologne from the crowd of my brother's business associates who'd come to be seen rather than to grieve. My brother Brian adjusted the microphone at the podium, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd worn his most expensive suit, the Italian one he bought with money he claimed came from a bonus, but I knew came from somewhere else. His eyes swept across the crowd before landing on me, and in that moment I knew he was about to do something cruel. It was the same look he'd had when we were kids, and he'd tell our parents lies about me, watching me get punished while he played the perfect son. "Before I continue with my eulogy," Brian said, his voice carrying that false sincerity he'd perfected over the years, "I think it's important we're all honest about who my father really was and what he really thought." The crowd leaned forward slightly. My Uncle Dennis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My Aunt Carol reached for her husband's hand. "My father Gordon was a truth-teller," Brian continued, loosening his tie theatrically. "He believed in calling things what they were, and I wouldn't be honoring him if I didn't share his final thoughts about family." My stomach dropped. I tried to catch my mother Patricia's eye, hoping she'd intervene, but she sat in the front row with her chin raised, that cold expression she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage carved into her features. She was wearing the pearl necklace Dad had given her for their anniversary, the one she'd complained about for being too small. "You see?" Brian's voice grew louder, more confident. "My father died with one great regret. One disappointment that haunted him until his final breath." He paused, savoring the moment. The funeral director stood nervously by the side door. Wendy, Brian's wife, kept her eyes fixed on her lap, her hands folded so tightly her fingertips were red. Gordon died thinking his daughter Thalia was nothing but a failure and a whore. The words hit the room like a physical force. Several people gasped. Others laughed nervously, the sound sharp and uncomfortable in the sacred space. But what hurt most was watching my mother nod slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see her agreement. "That's right," Brian continued, encouraged by the reaction. "My sister chose her career at a veterinary clinic over a real profession. She chose a failed marriage over family loyalty. And when that marriage ended, well, we all know what kind of woman leaves her husband, don't we?" More uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. I recognized some of them as Brian's golf buddies, men who'd never met my father, but came because Brian had invited them. They were enjoying this, treating my humiliation like dinner theater. I stood completely still, unable to move, unable to speak. My legs felt like they might give out, but I refused to show weakness. Not here, not in front of them. The tears burned behind my eyes, but I wouldn't let them fall. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to keep myself grounded. "The truth hurts," Brian said, his voice fake sympathetic now. "But Dad would want it told." He died ashamed of what his daughter had become. Those were literally his last words to me. "Brian, your sister turned out to be everything I tried to prevent." And I said, "I know, Dad. We all know." That's when I heard it. A small voice, clear and strong, cutting through the horrible silence that followed Brian's words. "Uncle Brian, you're lying." Every head in the room turned. My 9-year-old niece, Zara, stood up on the pew, still barely tall enough to see over the adults even standing. She was wearing the black dress with small daisies on it that I'd bought her last Christmas, the one she'd insisted on wearing because Grandpa loved daisies. In her small hands, she clutched a wrinkled envelope. Brian's face flushed red. "Zara, sit down immediately." But Zara didn't sit. She looked directly at her father with eyes that seemed far older than 9 years. "Grandpa gave me a letter. He said you might say mean things about Aunt Thalia at his funeral. He said if you did, I should read what he really wrote." The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. Someone's phone buzzed and they frantically silenced it. "That's enough, young lady." Brian started toward his daughter, but Zara took a step back, holding the letter higher. Should I tell everyone what Grandpa wrote about you, Uncle Brian? Her voice didn't waver. Should I tell them what he really said? About the money? About Mrs. Henderson? About why he changed his will? Brian froze mid-step. His face went from red to white so fast I thought he might faint. Wendy's head snapped up, her eyes suddenly alert and focused on her daughter. "What did you say?" Wendy's voice was barely a whisper, but in the silent room, everyone heard it. My mother stood up abruptly. "This is inappropriate." "Someone control that child." But Uncle Dennis stood up too, moving to position himself between Brian and Zara. "Let her speak," he said firmly. "If Gordon left a letter, we should hear it." The funeral director looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The crowd was frozen, waiting, and in that moment, looking at my small, brave niece standing up to the father who terrified her, holding a letter from the grandfather who'd seen all of this coming, I realized something. My father had known exactly what Brian would do. He'd known, and he'd planned for it. The man who'd never defended me in life had set up one final defense after death. "Read it." "Sweetheart," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Zara looked at me and smiled, a sad, knowing smile that broke my heart. Then she carefully unfolded the letter, and the entire room held its breath. 3 days before I stood in that funeral home, watching my world collapse, I had been examining a golden retriever with a broken leg at the Riverside Veterinary Clinic. The dog's owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, held his paw while I prepared the X-ray machine. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, the kind where I felt most like myself, surrounded by animals who needed help and people who trusted me to provide it. "You have such gentle hands, dear," Mrs. Chen had said. "Buddy never lets anyone touch him when he's hurt, but he trusts you." I was adjusting the X-ray plate when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which was unusual. Patricia Morrison didn't call me unless she needed something or wanted to criticize something. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Your father's had a heart attack," she said without preamble. "He's at Riverside General." It doesn't look good. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights I barely noticed stopping for. My father, Gordon Morrison, was only 58 years old. He still worked 60-hour weeks at Morrison Hardware, the store his father had opened and he'd inherited. He still went fishing every Sunday morning at Lake Patterson. He still brought injured birds to my clinic in shoeboxes, grumbling about the waste of time while secretly naming each one. By the time I reached the ICU, he was gone. The doctor, a young resident who looked exhausted, explained that the damage had been too extensive. "It was quick," he assured me, as if that made it better. He wouldn't have suffered. Brian was already there, still in his golf clothes, making arrangements on his phone. He glanced at me once, then returned to his conversation about funeral homes and flower arrangements. Wendy sat in the corner, scrolling through her phone, occasionally murmuring appropriate sympathies. My mother stood by the window, her face composed, already planning the funeral that would reflect well on her. "The Hendersons will expect an invitation," she was saying to Brian, "and the Rotary Club members. Your father was a member for 15 years. I stood in the doorway watching them plan my father's funeral like a social event and remembered the last conversation I'd had with Dad. It had been Sunday, just 3 days ago. He'd brought in a crow with a damaged wing. "This one's a fighter," he'd said, carefully transferring the bird to my examination table. "Reminds me of someone." "Dad, you can't keep comparing me to wounded animals." I'd laughed, checking the wing for breaks. "Why not? You fix them, don't you? Fixed yourself too after Martin." It had been 2 years since my divorce, 2 years since I'd moved back to Riverside from Seattle. The marriage to Martin had lasted 5 years, 5 years of slowly escalating control that turned into violence. The final straw had been when he'd broken my wrist for talking to a male colleague too long at a veterinary conference. I'd left with nothing but my clothes and my veterinary degree, driving through the night to escape. My family's reaction had been mixed. Dad had helped me find an apartment, never asking questions but somehow knowing the answers. Brian had immediately labeled me a failure, another example of my inability to stick with anything. And my mother had been the worst, suggesting that I must have done something to provoke Martin, that marriages required compromise. The divorce was a weakness in character. You know he rewrote his will last month. Brian's voice cut through my memories. He'd walked over while I was lost in thought, his phone finally silent. Changed everything after you moved back, said he needed to reassess his legacy. I don't care about the will, Brian. He laughed, that sharp bark that meant he was about to say something cruel. Of course you don't. You never cared about the family business, the family name, the family anything. Too busy playing with animals to be a real Morrison. The animals don't lie, I said quietly. They don't manipulate. They don't steal. His face darkened. Careful, sister. Dad's not here to protect you anymore. But that was the thing Brian never understood. Dad had never really protected me. He'd watched Brian torment me throughout childhood, stayed silent when Mom favored her son, looked away when they'd team up against me at family dinners. His protection came in small, quiet moments, teaching me to fish when Brian was at football practice, bringing injured animals to my clinic, showing up at my apartment with groceries when he knew I was struggling financially after the divorce. Thalia's here playing the devoted daughter now, Brian would announce at family dinners, his voice carrying across the table. But where was she when her career in Seattle was more important than family? She was building a life, Dad had said once quietly, but then fell silent when Mom glared at him. Building a life? Brian had scoffed. She was hiding from responsibility. Running away, like always. These dinners happened every Sunday after I moved back. I'd sit there, cutting my food into smaller and smaller pieces, while Brian held court and Mom nodded along. Dad would occasionally pat my hand under the table, a small gesture that meant everything and nothing. He loved me, I knew that, but he was too weak to fight for me. Now, standing in that hospital room, watching Brian orchestrate our father's funeral like a business merger, I realized that Dad's weakness had shaped us all. Brian had learned he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. Mom had learned her coldness would never be challenged. And I had learned to find love and acceptance anywhere but home, in the animals I healed, and the small community at the clinic who actually valued what I did. The funeral was set for Saturday. Brian made all the decisions while I stood silent, already knowing my assigned role. The disappointing daughter who would sit quietly while they revised history to suit their narrative. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth for March, the kind of day my father would have spent at the lake rather than inside a funeral home. I arrived at Shepard's funeral parlor at 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the service, hoping to have a moment alone with Dad. The parking lot was empty except for Brian's Mercedes and the funeral director's sedan. I found Brian in the funeral home's office, going through boxes of Dad's belongings that he'd cleared from the hardware store. Mom sat beside him, sorting through photographs with clinical detachment, discarding ones she deemed unsuitable for the memorial display. "This one's terrible," she said, tossing aside a photo of Dad and me at my veterinary school graduation. "He looks tired and Thalia's hair is a mess." "I'd like to keep that one," I said from the doorway. They both looked up, Brian's expression immediately shifting to annoyance. "You're early. The family viewing isn't until 11. I wanted to place something in the casket." I held up Dad's favorite fishing lure, a battered silver spinner he'd used for 30 years. He caught his first bass with this when he was 28. "Absolutely not," Mom said, standing up. "We're not turning your father's casket into a tackle box. The funeral director has already arranged everything appropriately." "It's one lure, Mom." He loved fishing. "He loved many things," Brian interjected, pulling out a manila folder from the box. "Want to know what he didn't love?" "Here, found this in his desk. Your last performance review from that clinic in Seattle. He kept it for some reason. Satisfactory performance. Lacks leadership initiative. Even your boss knew you were mediocre." "Why would Dad have that?" I asked, though I knew. Martin had forged it after hacking my email, part of his campaign to convince me I was worthless. I'd never seen it myself until now. "Because he kept track of all your failures," Brian said, standing up and walking closer. "Just like he tracked mine and Mom's successes. See the difference?" He spread papers across the desk, newspaper clippings of Brian's business awards, photos of Mom at charity galas, articles about the hardware store's expansion, Then he pushed another pile toward me, my divorce papers, a notice about my student loans, a photo of me from my wedding to Martin where my smile didn't reach my eyes. "This is what he kept about you," Brian said. "Your disasters." "Brian, enough," I said, my voice shaking. "It's his funeral." "Exactly. His funeral. And you want to make it about you, as always. Poor Thalia, the victim. Poor Thalia, the misunderstood daughter. Poor Thalia, who couldn't keep a husband or a real job. Being a veterinary assistant is a real job. It's what people do when they can't become actual veterinarians," Mom said coldly. "You had the grades, the acceptance letters, but you chose the easy path." Again. The funeral director knocked and entered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but guests are beginning to arrive." As the room filled with mourners, I found myself pushed further and further back. Brian had arranged the seating to reflect what he called proper family hierarchy. He and Mom in the first row with Wendy and other immediate family. I was placed in the third row behind Dad's business associates and golf friends. Uncle Dennis found me there, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're his daughter." "It's fine," I lied. "I can see from here." During the viewing, I watched Brian work the room like a politician, shaking hands and accepting condolences while occasionally glancing at me with satisfaction. He'd stationed himself by the casket, playing the role of devoted son, telling anyone who'd listen about his plans to modernize the hardware store, to honor his father's legacy. "Dad always said the store would stay in the family," he told Mr. Patterson, Dad's fishing buddy. He knew I understood business, understood what Morrison Hardware meant to this community. When I finally approached the casket, Brian stepped in front of me. "Make it quick. Important people are waiting." I looked down at my father, his face waxy and wrong in death. They'd styled his hair differently, parted on the wrong side. His hands were folded over a Bible he'd never read instead of the fishing magazine he always carried. Everything about this funeral was a lie, a performance for people who didn't really know Gordon Morrison. That's when Brian began his eulogy. He painted a picture of a father who'd built a business empire, who'd raised a successful son, who'd been married to a pillar of the community. He talked about disappointments, too, about investments that didn't pan out, ventures that failed. "But Dad's biggest heartbreak," Brian said, his voice taking on a false sympathy that made my skin crawl, was watching someone he loved choose failure repeatedly, choose the easy path, choose to run away from responsibility and respectability. Everyone knew who he meant. Heads turned slightly toward me, then away, embarrassed by the public shaming but too uncomfortable to intervene. "In his final days," Brian continued, now looking directly at me, "he told me his greatest shame was having a daughter who became exactly what he'd tried to prevent." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the crowd shift and murmur. "A failure. And let's be honest about what happened with her marriage. A whore." The word landed like a slap. Several people gasped. A few of Brian's business associates actually laughed, nervous and cruel. But the worst part was watching my mother nod slowly, deliberately, making sure everyone could see her agreement. "He's just being honest," Mom said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Gordon would want the truth told. He always said Thalia needed to hear hard truths." The room spun. My legs shook. 200 people were witnessing my public execution, and no one was going to stop it. This was Brian's final victory, using our father's funeral to destroy me completely. That's when I heard the small voice that would change everything. I stood up from my seat, my legs trembling, but my mind suddenly clear. The exit was 20 feet away, a straight path down the side aisle. I would walk out with whatever dignity remained, leave Riverside forever, and never look back. These people had won. They could have their version of history, their lies about who my father was and who I was to him. But as I turned toward the aisle, a small hand caught my black dress, tugging gently but insistently. I looked down to see Zara, Brian's 9-year-old daughter, standing in the aisle beside my row. Her face was streaked with tears, but her jaw was set with determination that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Aunt Thalia, please don't go," she whispered, though in the stunned silence following Brian's cruel words, everyone nearby could hear her. "Grandpa said this might happen." I knelt down to her level, trying to shield her from the staring crowd. "Zara, honey, you should go back to your mom." "No," she said firmly, and then louder. "No, I won't." She held up an envelope, wrinkled and slightly torn at one corner. My father's shaky handwriting was visible across the front. For Thalia, the truth. Brian had stopped mid-sentence at the podium, his face shifting from triumph to confusion. "Zara, what are you doing? Get back to your seat immediately." But Zara straightened her shoulders, looking so much like my father in that moment that my breath caught. "Grandpa gave me this letter last week. He made me promise something." The funeral director stepped forward uncertainly. Wendy half rose from her seat, her face pale. The crowd leaned in, sensing drama beyond the usual funeral proceedings. "He visited me at school during lunch," Zara continued, her voice growing stronger. "He said he was scared about his heart, said he'd been having pains. He gave me this letter and made me memorize what to do with it." "Zara Marie Morrison," Brian's voice was sharp with warning. "You will sit down right now or there will be consequences." That word, consequences, seemed to steal Zara's resolve. She turned to face her father fully. Like the consequences when you hit mommy? Or the consequences when you took money from Grandpa's safe and blamed the cashier? Wendy stood up completely now, her mouth open in shock. "Zara, what are you talking about?" "Grandpa knew everything," Zara said, clutching the letter tighter. "He wrote it all down. He said if Daddy was mean to Aunt Thalia at his funeral, I should read it to everyone. He said I'd know when the moment was right." My mother rose from her seat, her face flushed with anger. "This is absolutely inappropriate." "Someone remove that child immediately. She's obviously confused with grief." But Uncle Dennis moved into the aisle, positioning himself between Zara and anyone who might try to reach her. "Gordon was my brother for 58 years, he said calmly. "If he left a letter, we're going to hear it." "It's fake," Brian sputtered from the podium. "Dad would never. Zara's making this up for attention." Zara looked at him with those steady eyes. "You always say I'm just like Grandpa. Too stubborn, too nosy, too willing to stand up when I should sit down. Remember when you said that, Daddy? Last week when I asked why you were taking money from Grandpa's register?" The room erupted in whispers. Brian's business associates exchanged glances. Mr. Patterson, Dad's fishing buddy, stood up slowly. "Let the girl read the letter, Brian," he said. "If it's fake, we'll all know soon enough." I found my voice finally. "Zara, sweetheart, you don't have to do this. Your dad might be angry with you later." She looked at me with eyes far too wise for 9 years. "Grandpa said you'd try to protect everyone, even the people who hurt you. He said that's what made you special, but also what made you vulnerable. He said I couldn't let you protect Daddy this time." "This is insane," Brian said, starting to move from the podium. "I'm her father and I'm telling her to stop." "And I was Gordon's brother," Uncle Dennis said firmly, "and I'm telling her to continue." Aunt Carol stood up beside her husband. "I agree. Read it, honey." More people stood. Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Chen from the veterinary clinic who'd somehow heard about the funeral. Dr. Rodriguez, who owned the practice where I worked. Even some of Brian's associates stood, perhaps sensing the authenticity in Zara's voice, or maybe just morbidly curious about what would happen next. Wendy walked over to her daughter, and for a moment I thought she would take the letter away. Instead, she knelt beside Zara and said quietly, "Tell the truth, baby. Whatever Grandpa wrote, tell the truth." Brian's face had gone from red to purple. "Wendy, you can't be serious. She's 9 years old." "She's old enough to know right from wrong," Wendy replied, her voice carrying a strength I'd never heard before. "Something you seem to have forgotten." Mom tried one more time. "This is a funeral, not a circus. Gordon would be horrified." "Gordon would be proud," Uncle Dennis countered. "He always said the truth had a way of coming out. Looks like he made sure of it." Zara carefully unfolded the letter, her small hands steady now. The funeral home fell completely silent except for the sound of paper rustling. 200 people held their breath, waiting. "Should I read all of it?" Zara asked me. "Even the parts about Daddy and Mrs. Henderson?" Wendy's sharp intake of breath was audible throughout the room. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, slowly. Our neighbor? Brian lunged forward then, trying to reach his daughter, but Uncle Dennis and Mr. Patterson blocked him. "Don't you dare," he shouted. "That letter is private family business." "Then you shouldn't have made Aunt Thalia's pain public," Zara said simply. "Grandpa said if you could hurt her in front of everyone, everyone should know the truth about you." She looked down at the letter, then back up at me. "He loved you, Aunt Thalia. He loved you most of all. He wanted everyone to know that." I nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Read it, sweetheart. Read it all." Zara stood straighter, holding the letter with both hands, and began to read in her clear, young voice that carried across the silent funeral home. "My dear family, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and Brian is probably turning my funeral into another opportunity to hurt Thalia. Son, I've watched you manipulate and lie for years, but I stayed silent because I was a coward. No more." Brian made another attempt to reach his daughter, but this time several men stood up, forming a barrier. His face was purple with rage, veins bulging at his temples. Zara continued, "The truth about the will, I changed it last month, but not how Brian thinks. Everything goes to Thalia except for $1, which goes to Brian. The exact amount he stole from the register when he was 16 and blamed on Thalia. Yes, I always knew. I have the security footage saved, Brian. I've had it for 13 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My mother sank into her seat, her face white as paper. Brian has been embezzling from Morrison Hardware for 5 years. Every fake vendor payment, every inflated supply order, every cash withdrawal marked as emergency repairs is documented in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Only Thalia has access now. The evidence includes forged signatures, falsified invoices, and photographs of Brian loading stolen inventory into his Mercedes after hours. "These are lies," Brian shouted, his voice cracking. "Dad was senile." He didn't know what he was writing. Zara looked at her father steadily. "Grandpa said you'd say that. That's why he had Dr. Morrison, not related, do a cognitive evaluation 2 days before he wrote this. That report is in the safety deposit box too." She returned to the letter. "Patricia, my wife, you enabled Brian's cruelty because you saw yourself in him. You pushed away our daughter because she reminded you of your sister Margaret, who you've envied your whole life. Yes, I know about Margaret, how she married the man you loved, how she had the career you wanted. You punished Thalia for Margaret's sins, for being talented and kind when you wanted her to be bitter like you." My mother stood up abruptly. "This is fabricated. Gordon would never." "Sit down, Patricia," Uncle Dennis said sharply. "We all knew Gordon saw everything. He just never said it out loud until now." Zara continued reading. "But Thalia? She came back after Martin hurt her. Yes, I knew about the abuse, sweetheart. I hired a private investigator. I have photos of your bruises, copies of your medical records, recordings of Martin threatening you. They're all in the safety deposit box. I should have done something then, but I was still a coward, still afraid of Patricia's anger, Brian's judgment. I felt my knees buckle. Dad had known. He'd known everything and documented it. Uncle Dennis steadied me, his arm strong around my shoulders. Every Sunday dinner Thalia attended while Brian mocked her was torture for me. Every cruel word Patricia said about the divorce made me sick, but Thalia kept coming back, kept trying to love us. She worked at that clinic not because she failed, but because she found her calling. Dr. Rodriguez told me she could have been a veterinarian but chose to work directly with animals instead of managing a practice. She chose compassion over ambition. Dr. Rodriguez nodded from his seat. It's true. I offered her partnership 3 times. She turned it down to keep working hands-on with the animals. Zara's voice grew stronger. Brian, you visited only when you needed money. 43 times in 2 years you came to the store after hours. 41 of those times, money went missing. You thought I didn't notice the pattern, but I documented everything. The veterinary clinic building at 445 Maple Street, I bought it last year through a shell company. The deed is already in Thalia's name. The house on Willowbrook, also hers. The hardware store, she can sell it and use the money however she wants. But knowing Thalia, she'll probably turn it into an animal shelter. Wendy had moved away from Brian entirely now, standing with Zara. "Keep reading, baby." "Now for the hardest truth," Zara read, her voice wavering slightly. "Brian has been having an affair with Susan Henderson for 18 months. I have credit card receipts from hotels, photographs from the private investigator, and a very interesting video from the security camera at the store from last Christmas Eve, when you told Wendy you were doing inventory." "Stop!" Brian screamed, lunging forward again, but this time his own business partners held him back. "Susan Henderson?" Wendy's voice was deadly quiet. "The woman who babysits our daughter? Who comes to our house for dinner every Sunday?" Zara looked at her mother apologetically, then continued, "There's more. Brian has a second family in Riverside Heights, a woman named Cheryl and a 3-year-old son named Michael. He pays their rent from the money he steals from the store." The funeral home erupted. Wendy collapsed into a chair. Brian was screaming about lawsuits and lies. My mother was trying to leave, but found her path blocked by the crowd pressing in to hear more. "If Brian contests this will," Zara read, raising her voice over the chaos, "all evidence goes to the police, the IRS, and the state attorney general. If Patricia contests it, her own secrets come out, including the money she's been hiding from the IRS in her mother's maiden name, Patricia Winters. Furthermore," Zara continued, "I've established a trust for my granddaughter Zara, accessible when she turns 18, because she's the only Morrison besides Thalia with a functioning moral compass. Wendy, divorce Brian and take everything. I've already paid for your lawyer, Catherine Sharp. She's expecting your call." The letter's final words rang out clear. "Thalia, you were never a failure. You were the only success I had. A child who learned to love despite being surrounded by those who couldn't. I'm sorry I waited until death to defend you. Live freely now. You're finally free." Zara looked up from the letter, tears streaming down her face. "There's a postscript just for me. It says, 'Zara, you're brave like your Aunt Thalia. Take care of each other. The monsters can't hurt you anymore.'" Brian broke free and charged toward his daughter, but before anyone could stop him, Wendy stepped between them. The slap she delivered echoed through the funeral home like a gunshot. "3 years old?" she said, her voice deadly. "Our neighbor? A second family? You destroyed Thalia's reputation while living 3 separate lives." She turned to me, mascara streaming down her face. "Thalia, I'm so sorry." I knew he was cruel, but I never stood up to him. I was a coward too. The funeral director finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No," I said, standing up fully for the first time. "We're going to finish this funeral properly. My father deserves that much." I walked to the podium where Brian had stood, looking out at the assembled crowd, some shocked, some satisfied, some already on their phones, presumably calling lawyers or reporters. "My father was not a perfect man," I said. "He was weak when he should have been strong, silent when he should have spoken. But in the end, he found his courage. He made sure the truth would be told, even if he couldn't tell it himself." I pulled out the fishing lure I'd brought. This was his favorite lure. He caught his first bass with it when he was 28, the day after I was born. He said that fish taught him patience, that good things come to those who wait and work quietly. I walked to the casket and placed the lure in his hands, replacing the Bible. He waited too long to speak up, but he made sure his words would count when they came. The funeral ended in chaos, but somehow that felt more honest than the polished performance Brian had planned. He tried to grab the letter from Zara, but the funeral director had already called security. 2 officers escorted him out while he screamed about forgery and lawsuits, his face still purple with rage. My mother left through the side door without speaking to anyone. Her carefully constructed image shattered in front of the very society crowd she'd tried so hard to impress. That night, I sat, alone in my father's hardware store, using the key he'd hidden for me years ago under the broken parking lot concrete. The familiar smell of sawdust and metal polish filled my lungs as I walked through the aisles, running my fingers along the shelves he'd stocked just days before his death. In his office, I found the hidden room he'd mentioned in his private letter, concealed behind a false panel in the supply closet. Inside was everything he'd promised: boxes of evidence against Brian, stacks of cash in envelopes marked for Thalia's freedom, and photo albums my mother had claimed were destroyed. Every school play, every science fair, every birthday party she'd said weren't worth documenting. He'd saved them all, hidden them like treasures in this secret room where his love could exist without judgment. The letter he'd written just for me was on his desk, shorter and more personal than the one Zara had read. My darling Thalia, I was a weak man who let fear control him. Your brother inherited my worst traits, but you got the only good thing I had, my heart. I watched you save broken birds as a child, and now you save broken animals as a woman. You tried to save me too, even though I didn't deserve it. The store has been my prison, but it can be your freedom. Sell it, use the money to build something beautiful. You were never meant for hardware and invoices. You were meant for healing. I love you. I've always loved you. I just never knew how to show it when it mattered. 6 months have passed since that funeral. Brian is serving 5 years in federal prison after the IRS found he'd stolen over $200,000. They also uncovered 3 other businesses he'd been embezzling from using the skills he'd perfected at Dad's store. His second family disappeared after Cheryl discovered he had a third family in another county. Wendy divorced him within a month and got everything: the house, the cars, the hidden assets the forensic accountant found. She brings Zara to my new animal hospital every weekend where she volunteers in the recovery ward. Zara wants to be a veterinarian now, and she has the grades and determination to make it happen. My mother moved to Florida to live with her sister Margaret, the one she'd envied all those years. According to Margaret, who called me last month, Patricia spends her days sitting by the pool, refusing to discuss what happened. She's never reached out to me, never apologized, but Margaret says she keeps a photo of me from the funeral on her nightstand. It's the moment I stood at the podium, finally speaking my truth. I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure I care anymore. The hardware store sold for more than anyone expected. A young couple bought it, planning to turn it into a community makerspace. They kept the Morrison name out of respect for my father's legacy, the real one, not the one Brian tried to create. I used the money to expand the veterinary clinic into a full animal hospital with an emergency ward and a sanctuary for animals who can't be adopted. We opened the Gordon Morrison Memorial Wing last month. The plaque underneath his portrait reads, "For broken things that deserve to heal." At the opening ceremony, Zara cut the ribbon while wearing the daisy dress she'd worn to his funeral. "Grandpa would love this," she said, and I knew she was right. Dr. Rodriguez made me a full partner, but I still spend most of my time with the animals. Yesterday, someone brought in a crow with a broken wing, and I thought about Dad, about that last conversation we'd had. The crow was a fighter, just like he'd said, just like me. Some nights, I dream about that funeral, about the moment Zara stood up with that letter. A 9-year-old girl became the voice my father couldn't be in life, brave where he'd been cowardly, clear where he'd been silent. She saved me that day, this little girl who'd watched her family's cruelty and chose kindness instead. "Aunt Thalia," she asked me recently, "do you think Grandpa knew I'd be brave enough to read the letter?" "He knew you were my niece," I told her, hugging her close. That was enough. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living well, despite those who tried to break you. It's building something beautiful from the ashes of what they burned down. My father knew that. He also knew that sometimes the smallest voice in the room, a 9-year-old girl with her grandfather's letter, can bring down kingdoms built on lies. The funeral that was meant to bury me became my resurrection. And every animal we save, every life we heal, every day I wake up free from my family's poison is a testament to a father who found his courage too late in life, but just in time to save his daughter. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the black sheep in your family or found your strength in unexpected places, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below about a time when the truth finally came to light in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of redemption, courage, and the unexpected heroes who change everything. Remember, sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths.